I'm the coordinator of a project. It's Brexit and the Future of Europe project, of which this is the keynote lecture. This is a project which is funded, a Jean Monnet module, by the European Commission. And the purpose of the project is to investigate and discuss Brexit, the future challenges that are facing the European Union in this time of change, and with a particular focus on the position of Ireland in all this, which is perhaps uniquely impacted by these challenges in the historical time that we find ourselves in. As part of this, there is a speaker series. Last semester, we had a wonderful sort of mini workshop about the constitutional futures of these islands, which I think was fascinating. This term, we've had a talk by Laurent Besch about the rule of law crisis facing Europe, a kind of a slow burning, but a very almost existential crisis for the European Union, certainly very, very challenging for its legal system. And Ken McDonough of Dublin City University has also spoken about perhaps a little discussed aspect of Europe's future, which is defence cooperation. This is, as I said, the keynote lecture, and we're going to look at the future of Europe in general, and in particular Ireland in the future of Europe. And I'm quite sure that Brexit will also feature in that discussion. So I just want to introduce our speaker, Professor Brigid Laffan. I met Brigid many, many years ago. I remember sitting down in a classroom in the Badia and saying "Mi chiamo Stephen" in the middle of an Italian class, and the response from the person next to me was "Mi chiamo Brigid," and that was many, many years ago. My Italian probably has regressed since then. In fact, I can barely say that, unfortunately. But I am delighted that out of that lesson did come a meeting with Brigid and an acquaintance with Brigid. So very, very delighted to have Brigid with us today. I'll just say a couple of words about Brigid. So Brigid is the director and the professor at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. Before joining Florence, she was a professor at the School of Politics and International Relations at UCD, and she was also vice president of UCD and was principal of the College of Human Sciences in UCD from 2004 to 2011. Since 2004, she's been a member of the Royal Irish Academy. In 2018, she was ranked amongst the women who shape Europe by Politico. In September 2014, she was awarded the UACES Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2012, she was awarded the THESEUS Award for Outstanding Research on European Integration. And in 2010, she was awarded the National du Mérite, President of the French Republic. As well as being an outstanding scholar and genuinely world-leading expert in European integration, I think it's fair enough to say that Brigid is also an outstanding public intellectual and has made an incredible contribution to the discussion and the understanding of European integration issues, not just amongst the academic world or not in the academic world, but also amongst the public at large. We in Ireland have had the opportunity, I think the good opportunity of engaging with European integration matters through our democratic processes and through referenda. It has been an educated experience for the European public, and Brigid has played a role, I think, in allowing those processes, those referendum, to be as informed as possible and the best quality type of public discourse. I think now more than ever, as Europe goes through a period of change and perhaps challenges, we need people of the caliber of Professor Laffan to continue that role of educating the public, of communicating complex issues in a changing world to the public. So I hope, I'm sure that we will be educated by Professor Laffan's talk today. And without any further ado from me, I'll hand over to Professor Laffan to talk about Ireland and the future of Europe. But just housekeeping for about 40 minutes or so. And after that, we'll have a question and answer session. You can put any questions that you want to pose in the Q&A chat function, and then I will moderate them afterwards. So now, without any further words from me, I will hand over to Brigid.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to speak at this event in UCC. I would much prefer to be in Cork and joining you. I was to do this lecture last April, and we decided to delay it so that I could come in person. But of course, COVID does not allow for that. So it has to be Zoom and share screen for this afternoon. In fact, I will speak to three themes this afternoon. I will talk about Brexit. I will talk about the Brexit and the EU, and then the interaction and intersection between that and Ireland and its future in the EU. So a rather a permissive terrain. So let me begin by sharing my screen. And then, yes. So firstly, I think it's important, given the centrality of Brexit to Ireland, that when talking about the EU and Ireland and the future of Europe, that we frame what Brexit was and then take it on from there. So the first issue to address is, what was Brexit a case of? That's a very classical social science question. It certainly initially was a crisis. When the Berlaymont and the Justice Lipsius building and all of the permanent representations of the EU woke up to the outcome of the Brexit referendum on the 24th of June 2016, it was perceived and received as a shock. Not necessarily surprise, but a shock. A shock in the sense that this was one more crisis for the EU, having had a decade of crisis. It was after in the midst of the legacy of the Eurozone crisis, the refugee crisis, a very unstable neighborhood for Europe. It was also because it was about membership. It was about someone leaving the club. It was very emotional. I've been told, because I say it's my last book, I hope it is, I'm writing a book on the EU's response to Brexit, how the EU has managed Brexit. There were tears in the institutions that day, mostly from British officials who suddenly realized that what their life's work was gone, that they had joined the Commission, the Council as functionaires, and suddenly the UK was leaving. And that was very emotional. But for the leaders of the institutions, it was also a time of fear. Could this be a domino process? Could this lead to the disintegration of the EU? And there was a sense in which that this might be the straw that would break the camel's back, the sort of one more crisis that the system simply didn't have the capacity to handle. And I think it's very interesting to look at scholarly responses. All of the responses I have here were written in 2016, albeit in two cases published in 17. And here we have very senior scholars of European integration. Their immediate response was Ben Rosmond, Brexit might mean for both the UK and the EU that it has become the defining question of contemporary European politics. In other words, salience and centrality. Ivan Krastev, if the disintegration of the EU was only recently considered unthinkable, after Brexit it seems, and entre guillemets in the eyes of many, almost inevitable. But he himself was someone who was writing about disintegration at the time. And Matthias, the United Kingdom vote to leave the UK has triggered the worst political crisis the EU has ever faced. All wrong. All three initial academic assessments were wrong. And this points to something we see not just in academia, but also in the media, that you get a lot of what I call presentism in analysis of the EU. It strikes me that every EU crisis is translated into an existential crisis for the Union almost immediately, not just by academic observers, but also by practitioners and also the media. So one has to ask then, how do we think about Brexit, given this sense that this was a crisis that the EU could not cope with? Well, obviously, there are three ways of thinking about it. One, that this was disintegration. Two, that it was rather classical secession, that when we look at the history of state breakup, that there are elements of it in Brexit. But in my view, the most compelling academic conceptual framework for analysing Brexit is differentiation, variable geometry. So firstly, disintegration. Yes, Brexit had disintegrative potential. It could have been the beginning of a domino effect, but it wasn't. It neither led to systemic disintegration nor policy disintegration in the EU. So I would rather frame it as a secession. It wasn't leaving it. It wasn't akin to a decision by a state to leave an international organization. This was much deeper than that, because the UK was embedded not just as a member state, it was embedded in an additional constitutional framework, policy framework, political system. Of course, it wasn't, because the EU political system is broader and shallower than a nation state. It wasn't quite of the order of the breakup of, for example, if Scotland voted for independence. It wasn't the breakup, secession in that sense. And for me, differentiation is by far the best concept, because differentiation helps us think about the UK as a member state and now as a third country. The UK was the champion of opt-outs in the EU. It had more opt-outs than any other member state. It was outside core EU regimes, Schengen, the euro, and at one stage, social policy. And so its whole practice of membership was opting out, and on occasion, particularly in the area of justice and home affairs, opting back in. And so the mindset in the United Kingdom, the psychological and conceptual habits of mind in the United Kingdom in the lead up to that referendum was that of a country that had opt-outs and was not a fully paid up member to all of the regimes that the EU had. But what Brexit meant was that the UK was on a journey from the 24th of June. The UK was on a journey from internal opt-outs, differentiation as an EU member state, to external differentiation. And external differentiation is an entirely different proposition. It completely alters the power balance between the country wanting opt-outs, opt-ins, if you're a member state or if you're a third country in the making. And having captured that as elegantly, the models of external differentiation, as Barnier's very famous escalier, which was a very powerful framing. Now, why did the Commission, the task force, develop that as stairs? Because of course the world is far more complex than the neat stairs portrayed there, or the ladder. And that diagram was not for public use initially. That diagram was brought to the European Council. And when the European Council was beginning to think about the EU future relationship with the UK, Barnier wanted to frame it for them in hard choices. He wanted to make sure that the heads of government understood that the EU had different models, beginning with full membership, then EEA, then the Swiss, etc., etc., etc. And so what was for internal consumption initially morphed into something that became very powerful in the negotiations, because as you see, the UK went from the top of that stairs right down, and on occasion came very close to no deal. At several stages in the negotiations, no deal was a credible outcome of these negotiations. And so we're left with, and this diagram here shows you the UK's differentiation system of differentiated integration in all of its glory. But the takeaway from the diagram here is that the United Kingdom is now, post the first January this year is at the outer rim and has weaker relations with the EU, having been a member state, than Turkey has. And that's an extraordinary place to end up, that you go from membership to this outer rim. And in fact, I would say that the only European country with weaker relations than the UK today is Russia. And that's, again, something, when we think about geopolitics, how did we end up here? And when we look at how and why we ended up with this diagram, with the UK being in the outer circle, it can be explained firstly on both parties, the UK and the EU. So firstly, it was the win set that could be constructed from the red lines of both sides. And the red lines of both sides were clear very early on. So in other words, although if you were thinking about where the UK would end up on the 24th of June, you mightn't have thought it would be the outer circle. By autumn 16, it was the contours of the relationship were becoming very clear, and the win set was very narrow. This relationship has been produced by what people didn't want or wouldn't agree to, than any positive agenda of the kind of cooperation that one would expect between neighbours. So on the EU side, the concern from the beginning was membership had to matter, that there had to be a balance between rights and obligations, that a third country could not have the rights of a member state because they were unwilling to take on the obligations. And that manifested itself in the mantra, no cherry picking. And of course, we have Johnson's very famous, well, I like my cake and eat it. The second element, so the rights and obligations was macro to the EU, but then the single market and the four freedoms. Within 1 week, the EU had said, we will protect the integrity of the single market and the four freedoms are indivisible, and we will protect the autonomy of our decision-making system and our legal system. In lights from a very early stage. Then moving to the UK side, Theresa May indicated very early, exit the single market, exit the customs union, no EU law, and freedom to diverge. Now, May tried to row back from those hard red lines. She tried very hard to pinkify them through autumn 17 to September 18. But there was no Brexit that would have got through the House of Commons that didn't stick very closely to the UK red lines. And so one has the core explanation for where we've ended up is a clash of sovereignty practices. I argue that it's sovereignty practices rather than sovereignty, because if you argue that it's just the British led by a sovereignty first Brexit, the underlying assumption is that the other member states of the EU are not sovereign. And there is none of the 27 that think they're not a sovereign state. They don't frame themselves in that way. They have their own constitutions, etc., etc. So it is it's a choice about how to exercise sovereignty. In other words, living sovereignty in practice. And the EU sovereignty model from the beginning is a model of sharing, collective sharing, and the pooling of sovereignty. And stemming from that a sense that states, and remember there are 22 small states in the EU, and the large EU states are not that large at all, particularly if we think of the world of great power competition, China and the US. Yes, there are constraints on legal sovereignty in the EU, the whole edifice of European law is built on constraints on national legal sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is opened up. Politics may begin at home, national elections may retain maybe the most salient political events in the life of each member state, but it no longer ends there. It's opened up to a new layering and a political system, what I call here polity creation. Now, that sovereignty model is the model that the member states wanted to protect, because for them, that sovereignty model is a model whereby they handle interdependence. It both creates interdependence, manages interdependence, and ensures that the mutual vulnerability of a member state is contained in law, constrained by law, and also by institutions. And it's interesting that Mario Draghi, who was president of the ECB for a very long time, and now Prime Minister of Italy, in his very first speech to the Italian Senate, he said to the senators, there is no sovereignty in solitude. Because, of course, as we know, there is a strong Eurosceptic strain in Italian politics just now. So Mario Draghi was essentially saying, be mindful of solitude. And of course, the model, and particularly the hard Brexit model, is an angst about, stemmed from an angst about sovereignty, rests on that constitutional artifact of the sovereignty of Parliament, although in my view, a lot of Brexit has been about strengthening executive power in the UK and not parliamentary power. But the mantra of we want control of our borders, our laws, our waters, and money really drove the British negotiators. They lectured the other side on sovereignty and what it was. And this is, from a social science perspective, it's very interesting that the power of an idea, sovereignty, can so overwhelm material interest, which again is something that I think we need to think about, that the way the ideas can become so strong in terms of driving political outcomes to the neglect of the material well-being of the country concerned. And for our book, we've been interviewing people in the negotiations, and one very senior European Council official said in one of the interviews that the British paid 80% of the focus of the British was on sovereignty and 20% on actually solving problems. And I think that's again something that is quite remarkable given the deep interdependence of the 21st century. So what were the consequences of this for the EU? This EU that Ireland is now will be a member of. Firstly, the EU it compelled the EU. It pushed the EU to draw on its strengths and resources and identity as a political system. It had to draw on its market power and as a producer of European public goods. And it had to really adapt agency in framing Brexit. And so, interestingly, we know from the literature and from the day-to-day EU policymaking that there are always turf battles between the institutions. There is always a to and fro between the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. But in this set of negotiations, the EU behaved like a collective power. And one of the things that is emerging from the EU in crisis, and we see it again with the pandemic, albeit not in quite such a clear-cut way, that collective power Europe is becoming a reality to match with diverse Europe, cleavage Europe, conflict Europe, but there also is a strengthening of collective power Europe, albeit patchy. So that collective power Europe, in this case, was used firstly to frame Brexit. The EU were unified, they were committed to the future of the Union, and the UK was this third country in the making. The EU drove process. It had the mantra NNWN, no negotiation without notification, the phased approach. It was Chefsache. The European Council remained seized of the issue, and it was seamless across the institutions. The networks and the ease of working on Brexit across the Council, the Commission, and the Parliament was unparalleled. And that again stemmed from that basic commitment to unity and to something called the polity, to that shared polity. Observation I would make is that the EU put its very best people on this dossier, a very strong multinational team of some of the finest officials in all of the institutions. And then it worked the institutions and the knowledge that it had, the screening of the acquis, all of the TCA and the withdrawal agreement. The initial documents that emerged were always from EU text. So the British could negotiate down, but they didn't have the capacity to produce the equivalent of a large 800-page, 1,000-page treaty. They did not have that capacity. And then the other thing the EU did was it created a bypass in all of the institutions for Brexit. So the Council had a task force, the Commission had a task force, the Parliament had a special, so that, and this is again, I'm using a quote from an official that we've interviewed, so that Brexit could not pollute EU policymaking, EU legislation, and that the EU would go on with its own agenda, free from Brexit. So, in other words, there was the EU used the power that it had, and that power was asymmetric, both because of the structure of Article 50, but also simply one country is not as powerful as the market power and political power of 27. So where are we 4 months into economic Brexit? We have an extraordinarily thin deal, as I said already. It's a deal that is not suitable for the level of interaction that one would expect between near neighbours like this. It is not a particularly stable equilibrium, either the TCA or the WA. We've already seen a lot of conflict about the implementation, particularly of the withdrawal agreement, the Northern Ireland Protocol. And we've also had the episode, which is very telling, of the UK's, the Foreign Office's refusal to recognise the EU ambassador as a full ambassador. 142 countries around the world do, but London can't. And London can't because it wants to frame the EU as an international organisation. David Frost, in his engagement with Barnier, kept referring to your organisation or your international organisation. He couldn't even bring himself to call the EU the European Union. And that, I think, as I don't know if you're aware, but Michel Barnier at the end of this month has his journal is coming out in French and then later in English. And I think it will make very interesting readings, and I hope he's indiscreet. So we have a very and contested relationship between the UK and the EU, one that, in my view, is not suited to the kind of relationship these two partners need. But as long as you have a sovereignty first mindset in London, and the EU will rightly want to continue to ensure that there isn't cherry picking, then I think it will be very difficult to rebuild, at least under this government, to rebuild the relationship. But of course, the TCA is dynamic, it's full of reviews, and as a rebuilding of the relationship, although not membership, over the next 10 to 20 years. But Brexit also has a longer term impact on the EU. And I'm not just talking about the nature of the relationship between neighbours, but also the UK will be a source of regulatory competition. And the question is, will that competition be benign or not? And that's why you've the level playing field provisions in the TCA. The British are very clear that they're ahead in technology, and particularly in AI, and they want the freedom to diverge in that area. Technology, on finance, and if they want a relationship with the United States, a trade agreement with the United States, then they will have to diverge on food regulations as well. So regulatory competition, how much divergence, where will that divergence be, and how will the EU respond? And it's interesting that both the Commission and the Council have set up dedicated post-Brexit units to maintain a horizontal view over the dossier. In other words, the UK is not any normal third country in the sense that because of its proximity, and the UK will keep a very close eye indeed. There's also the UK, the global Britain, the pivot to Asia Pacific. Interestingly, the French have already done that. I think the Germans are also thinking about the future of their relationships in the Pacific. But as the UK attempts to fulfill the global Britain mantra, then again, how will that impact on EU foreign policy? Will the UK, if the UK begins to grow more rapidly than the EU, if it's more agile in its response to some global and domestic issues, the vaccine is one example of that. Will it be a model either for existing member states, some argue this, or for the EU's neighbours? So would Norway begin the European Economic Area Agreement and begin to want more and less close relations? So these are the sorts of things that will impact. Now, interestingly, there has been one significant Brexit dividend to the EU, and a really important one, and that is the whole budgetary agreement of July 2020 on the Pandemic Recovery Fund and on the MFF, where the EU agreed an unprecedented firepower in terms of response to the pandemic, 1.8 trillion, much more than public finance capacity of the EU in the past. It will also do it on the basis of shared borrowing on the financial markets. So this broke a taboo in the EU, and I see could have agreed to the deal that was agreed in July 2020. Knowing the history of the UK budgetary politics, its attitude to the EU budget, but also to Cameron's use of the veto, the fiscal treaty in December 11, no London government would have agreed either to shared borrowing or to grants. So I think although in looking at the comparative response to the pandemic, the UK has clearly been more effective at vaccine rollout, the EU would not have been able to come up with the historic agreements that were clear in July 2020, and we know that the own resources decision still needs to go through quite a number of parliaments. The Bundesverfassungsgericht has obviously decided not to take a case on this. This was very smart, but it could not have got to where it's got. The Recovery and Resilience Fund with the British. Now, the EU has a very strategic, I think von der Leyen must think that the gods were not with her, because when she presented her political program in 2020, it looked as if the EU was coming out, in 19, it looked as if the EU was coming out of crisis, and that the EU could begin to focus again on major strategic transformative dossier, on the Green Deal, on digital, on Europe's place in the world, and on the a social contract, the future of work, between economic and social integration. The big ticket items that Europe has to confront. And her program was very much in tune with the leaders' program, but also very much in tune with what needs to be done. And so she must have thought, I have an opportunity as Commission President to be the equivalent of Delors, to really drive a transformative agenda. And of course, she took office in December 19, and within 3 months was confronted with the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic is so important very quickly because it was a matter of life and death. And it also required the exercise of public power at every level, because only public power could maintain health systems and money in people's pockets and businesses to try to maintain a level of social cohesion while economies were put in a coma. So for the EU now, there is a very testing time in terms of the recovery. Firstly, the completion of the vaccine programs across the member states, and then the nature of the recovery and what level of scarring, either for intergenerationally or by country, will the pandemic leave. And so that, because we know from the crisis of 08, 09, 10, 11, and 12, that economic crisis had a dramatic political impact on Europe, on incumbents. A lot politics in Europe will be determined by the nature of the recovery over the next number of years. But all of that doesn't mean that that there can be distraction from the strategic goals that the EU has. Because the climate crisis, there is no place to hide from the climate crisis. There's no place to hide for Europe from the need to adapt to ensure that it's not left behind in the digital world. And of course, democracy in Europe requires maintenance of a social contract and the legitimacy of our democracies. So despite COVID, the core strategic issues remain. Of course, Europe also finds itself in an extraordinarily unsettled and difficult neighborhood. It is becoming a disruptive power in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's testing the Greeks and the Cypriots. It's testing with drilling and all sorts of things, and it's weight around. It's a NATO member state. It is still a candidate country for membership of the EU, although I don't see that any longer in my lifetime. But Turkey has become a disruptive state, and the relationship between the EU and Turkey is extremely tense and very difficult because of migration. That Turkey knows that it can turn on and off the tap in terms of control of the flow of migrants and refugees. The MENA region, North Africa, instability and war, the tragedy of the Syrian conflict. Libya has, for the first time ever, or first time in a very long time, sorry, not ever, has one government now. So how can the EU reinforce or arrive at some level of stability in its near neighborhood? And of course, you go south of the MENA, Africa is obviously central to Europe, its future and its well-being. And then there's Russia. It's very difficult to underestimate just how disruptive Putin has been in a European context. He is testing Ukraine again, but it's not just testing Ukraine, it's the subversion within the EU, the support for the radical right, anything that disrupts the EU is good for Putin. Sometimes I wish Putin would concentrate on making Russia a better place for Russian citizens and not playing all these silly games outside. But these are disruptive states. And Europe, the whole ethos of the EU was so-called normative power Europe, where we wanted the world to be more like Europe, more multilateral, more institutional, more rule of law, etc., etc. And that's not the world Europe finds itself in the 21st century. The world we find ourselves in is a world of renewed great power competition, and geopolitics is back with a bang. And on great power competition, there is the overwhelming issue for the United States today is the rise of China. That's the lens through which everything is looked at. And it was, in a sense, easy with Trump in the White House because the Europeans had good reason not to have to engage with Trump. But the Biden administration are also being extremely tough on the China question. And so where does Europe lie on great power competition? Does it want a between the US and China? Can't do that because of but on the other hand, it doesn't want to follow blindly US policy on China either. So there are all these very big, we're in one of those historical moments when times are trans-shifting and where there are deep structural changes in geopolitics and in global economics. And the EU has to find a pathway through this. And that's where we find all of the narrative of strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, the Macron case or vision for the EU. And I know, for example, that the EU is strengthening its trade defense mechanisms. It's reviewing very carefully its supply chains. It's beginning to look at ensuring that the supply chain vulnerabilities exposed during the pandemic are corrected. So that's an EU that has a very strategic agenda, has a very transformative agenda. It's clear that the demand for this agenda is there. And the question is, can politics in Europe and the European economy respond to the demand? Is there the capacity in Europe to handle what are very, very demanding policy areas? And of course, I should have, of course, referred to the Sofa Gate at the visit to Ankara. So, where does Ireland lie in this terrain of both developments in the EU 27 and then also Brexit? So just like the EU is at a critical juncture, then for Ireland, Brexit was and remains a critical juncture. And it remains a critical juncture in the following senses. This was the first geopolitical shock to Ireland since the Second World War. And the father of geopolitics, Mackinder, talked of geopolitics was economic wants and geographical opportunities. Or Sloan and Gray more recently, geography can be described as the mother of strategy. And of course, we know that Ireland's geography is that of an island, geographically peripheral, the continent, a very close proximity to a once great power, an imperial power, and was part of the homeland of that power. So Brexit has brought geography back with a bang for Ireland. Secondly, of course, it impacts in terms of geoeconomics, because Ireland is a very, very globalized country. We're always in the top 2 or 3 on the globalization index, and we depend for our crust on exports. So anything that alters that, either globally or regionally, or in the context of these islands, has an impact. But then thirdly, Brexit has the potential to become existential for the state. In other words, because it has opened up the prospect of deep transformation on the island of Ireland, then it potentially is transformative of the Irish state and its political system. And it doesn't get bigger than that. So for all those reasons, Ireland is at a critical juncture. And if what we want to think about it, when Ireland joined the EU in 1973, suddenly its geopolitical world had come together. Ireland had the rootedness of being an EU member state. It had the rootedness of being an EU member state with its nearest neighbour, the United Kingdom. It could and did open its economy to a multinational investment, and particularly US investment, and from the 2000s onwards with the Asia strategy to the rest of the world. So all of Ireland's geopolitical wants were met in the joint membership of the UK and Ireland in the EU. And now the UK has moved off. And also, and I might as well take the opportunity to, if you remember going back to 2000, when Mary Harney wanted to juxtaposition Ireland to Boston than Berlin, and arguing we were culturally nearer Boston than Berlin. But what she posited as a choice was never a choice for Ireland. Ireland was able to be a member state of the EU, but also very close to Washington. It was never a choice between Boston and Berlin. Ireland could have both. But as you see, I have divided that cake because the UK has now moved into a different relationship with the EU, and of course, Ireland the most impacted by that. In terms of geoeconomics, we're obviously uniquely exposed because of the high trade density, and this is a Copenhagen study, and particularly agri-food, but also the land bridge. Now, I always thought, although I'm not an economist, that the Irish economy would adapt, because one of the strengths of the Irish economy, we saw this through the financial crisis, is its adaptability. And Ireland, as a small country, only needs a small slice of global good to be prosperous. So I always thought that there was this capacity in the Irish system to respond, and also the Irish state agencies did a really very good job in trying to make at least signal to Irish companies that they needed to be Brexit ready. And of course, we now see the remaking of Ireland's geography with all of those new openings to the continent. And I always have a wry smile when I see the French embassy with its large banner reminding us that France is now our nearest EU neighbour. So geopolitics, geography is never entirely set because it can be reframed with connectivity. And again, that was extremely rapid. And what we will see, of course, is changes in the supply chains. They're happening already. Of course, we won't understand the impact of Brexit on the Irish economy because it's until post-COVID and the economies open up. But for me, I remember when David Cameron gave that Bloomberg speech, and I was about to go back into the classroom in UCD, having been out for 6 years as Dean and Vice President. And as I was preparing my lecture that morning, I read the Bloomberg speech, which had just been delivered. And I said, I'm going into that classroom and I'm going to talk about this letter, because this letter has the transformative potential, both for Ireland and the EU. And it was a way of getting, one of the challenges for us is how you get your students hooked. So I was using Cameron and Bloomberg to get my students hooked that morning, rather than the dry commission, council, parliament, etc., etc. So for me, from the beginning, the first thing that went through my mind when I read the in-out referendum, I thought Northern Ireland. And that is existential for Ireland. To the border, the Good Friday Agreement, the shared management of the island, and the future of the two on the island are all bound up with this in Brexit. And it's really important as a society that we learn from Brexit, and if there is a transformative future, if this will transform our states and our political systems, and inevitably our society, that we begin to have a deliberative process to look very carefully at it. Because Ireland, since its foundation, has had the great good fortune to have maintained its democracy and a high level, certainly high in comparison to many other countries. And we shouldn't take that for granted, and we shouldn't lightly rush into referendums and border polls, but have the deep discussion about consequences and a reimagining of a future and the pathways to that future that may or may not happen. So on Brexit, if you just look at these maps, the referendum shows you the yellow, that was all Remain. And then the green are Sinn Féin, and the lighter green, the SDLP in foil. So there's one overwhelming conclusion to draw from the political geography there, and that is you will not get consent to a border, a visible border, on the island of Ireland. The people, it's not even about Dublin, it's about the people who live on either side of that border. They will not consent to a return to the borders of the past, and they will not consent to any visible borders. So that meant that I need to check my time. That meant that from the beginning, a land border was not possible, and that then had two implications. There were two ways of handling it: a soft Brexit or a sea border. And as we know, the sea border is where we ended up. It's not a good place to be, but Tina, there is no alternative other than a soft Brexit. Now, I was going to look at the negotiations and how we got to where we got, but I won't, because I want to move on, finish on Ireland and the EU. We can go back in questions and talk about how we got the protocol and how the protocol is working. So Ireland and the EU at the second decade of the 21st century, it is Ireland's essential geopolitical anchor and shelter. The alternative is an asymmetric relationship with the United Kingdom. And I can't see any circumstances in which either an Irish government, but more importantly, the Irish people, would ever want to find itself in that asymmetric relationship again. And also our size. The UK has some crack at managing to have a prosperous economy outside the EU. But for Ireland, it would be the Albanian option. And we know what that meant. So that leaves us then with the EU being the shelter and the anchor. And therefore, major areas of public policy have got to fit with that shelter and anchor, but we've got to shape that shelter, we've got to shape those policies, and we've got to navigate that very strategic agenda I spoke about. The Green Deal. To what extent are we as a society and our public policies, are we where we should be in terms of a sustainable development? Have we the kinds of public transport systems, the sustainable housing, sustainable cities, our problem in agriculture? Are we ready for the kind of transformation that is required? And if not, when can we be? And to what extent will we be a leader at a European level in forging a more sustainable Europe, a more sustainable Ireland, but also a more sustainable Europe? Digital. Dublin is capital to the major techs. We're now European regulators and not just Irish regulators. And again, are we up to the task? Are our public institutions up to the task? Corporation tax. Interestingly, I always thought that it would be pressure from the United States that really, in the end, would crack corporation tax in Ireland. And we see the Biden administration is radical in its approach to this. And I think from an Irish perspective, and I go on to show some stats on how committed the Irish are to this, the government has moved with the roadmap on corporate tax to get rid of the most egregious practices that were there. And again, I think it's a domestic conversation that we should have. I thought it was very interesting that Ireland was one of the 9 member states to sign the letter on the need for a common on a common fund, a new generation fund for post-pandemic Europe. I thought that was very smart. It was placing Ireland on the right side of history and giving Ireland some space. It would have been a disaster, in my view, if Ireland had opted to be part of the frugal Hansa states when it came to the budget negotiations. And then, of course, Ireland has to position itself on all of these issues of strategic autonomy, the transatlantic relationship, and the great power competition, because close to Washington matters, but we also want to trade. So again, we're on the open rather than protectionist side of the EU argument. And post-UK, that's a weaker group in the EU. So I think, again, there's a whole set of issues there about positioning Ireland. Now, we were fortunate today. I was looking at the Red Sea poll this morning. The Irish European movement does us all a great service every year by polling the Irish on key attitudes to Europe. The top headline is 84% of respondents favour EU membership. That's very high, but it's potentially shallow. I have always thought that on any European treaty that would be put to the Irish people, you have at least a third of voters will vote against. And the question is, depending on what combination of circumstances, that can become a majority, as it did both in Nice 1 and Lisbon 1. So no Irish government should take that electorate for granted. Ensuring that the Irish understand the debates, engage with the debates is really important. That's a Red Sea poll tells us on more Europe. The Irish electorate want more digital regulation, very committed to the rule of law. Interestingly, defence and climate. The Irish are dissatisfied with what the EU is doing on climate. It's not doing enough. On less Europe, or at least not more Europe, the Irish electorate in this poll the respondents did not want to see more health responsibility move to a European level, and disagreed also that on further centralization of tax or economic policy. That's the corporate tax issue. It's deeply, deeply embedded in the country. And then on the referendum, on a future referendum on the Conference of the Future of Europe, 52% agreed that there could be a referendum post this process, post the Conference on the Future. So I think there's a very mixed bag there of the kind of Europe that the Irish electorate or Irish society wants. Let me draw this to a conclusion, and apologies because I'm sure I've gone over time. For Ireland and the EU, firstly, it's a place we belong. And here this was the last line of a talk given in the early 2000s by Bertie Ahern, a place we belong. It is the anchor and shelter, and small states need anchoring and sheltering in a world of profound change. You need anchors of stability. The trick for Ireland is to ensure that there is a compatibility between domestic policy and EU policy, between the internal and the externals. And the choices are very political. They're about politics and political balances around our model of economy and tax and the Green Deal. And it's best as a society that we have a deliberative process internally on these issues, rather than that we feed Euroscepticism, which basically is most Eurosceptic arguments, not all, but they come from a model of us versus them, and a populist model of a nation state that's no longer available in the highly dependent world we live in. I look forward to your questions, and again, apologies if I've gone over time.
I think I'm showing now. Hello. Thank you very much, Brigid, for an absolutely a sort of a tour de force. I mean, covering a huge amount of ground there, touching on major issues, really significant importance, strategic importance for Ireland, Brexit, future of Europe, and I hope we'll be able to cover a little bit more of them in questions and answer. So if people want to pose their questions, you can do so by using the Q&A function. There's none there at the moment, so I might use this opportunity to kind of take advantage of the position that I find myself in. I have lots of notes scribbled in front of me, so I'll try and limit my questions. There were a couple of sort of terms or concepts that you used. One, first of all, and this is not really a question, but just that the framing of sovereignty or the presentation of sovereignty, I find is really, really useful and sort of encapsulates or brings clarity to that debate, I think, and the use of that term. It's such a totemic term, I think, and it has been abused or misunderstood. It's useful, and I think it really links well to Ireland's position, especially comparative to the UK, you know, that it's a different exercise of sovereignty, it's a different understanding of sovereignty that Ireland has. I presume, by the way, that you would see Ireland, largely speaking, either the government or the people as subscribing to the EU model of sovereignty based on historical experience or whatnot. But I mean, I think it's interesting to see how can arrive at very different understandings of what sovereignty means. But in terms of questions, so you also mentioned collective power Europe becoming a reality, which I find very, very interesting, particularly in response to crises. And then at a later point, you mentioned that Europe is facing these significant geopolitical challenges and other challenges, I suppose, in terms of internal policy and development that will require political capacity to act. And whether that exists or not is sort of partly misrepresenting a sort of an open question. I just wonder if you could, that was kind of said slightly in passing, but if you could develop that a little bit more, like where does the institutional capacity or political capacity, I suppose, that can be, you can look at that at the level of institutions. They work very well in the Brexit, but also there's a question of political legitimacy, bringing the member states and that also needs to be an issue. So I suppose I'll just leave that at this stage. It's a bit of a long question, but that's just something which sort of interests me, I suppose. How do you get this collective capacity to act? And has the experience of crises, I suppose, informed us or told us something about how that might come about? Sorry.
So thank you. I will say something about sovereignty and the comparison between the UK and Ireland, because I've just written a chapter on sovereignty and how it helps us understand where we ended up with Brexit, both as a driver of Brexit, but also a driver of the outcomes. And as I did that paper, I really had to interrogate what was meant by the UK's sovereignty first Brexit, on level playing field, and it was about not accepting any commitment externally, but particularly to the EU. And there is, in my view, a great paradox, because Ireland is a very young state, historically speaking, 100 years old, a state that was formed out of a state-seeking nationalism. So if one were to think about a country that would be fixated on sovereignty, or a country that would find it difficult to share sovereignty, and you looked at Irish history, you might come to the conclusion that Ireland would be one of those states. And yet it is larger power. It's London and the UK, and particularly GB, that is fixated on a very old and, in my view, outdated concept of sovereignty. And it's something to do with, it's a country, if we think about it, it's a union state. And so it's a country that doesn't have clear internal sovereignty. This English sense of there being freedom and control over our laws, our borders, etc., etc. It's a very interesting phenomenon that we look at. And so I think that the Irish electorate, as a small state, we do understand the limits of sovereignty. I think we've a lived experience of the limits of sovereignty, of that UK GB sovereignty. On the political capacity to act, so the EU is always going to struggle. It's always going to struggle because it's 27 countries. It is a continent of deep diversity. Diversity of development, diversity of language, culture, and history. So it doesn't have it can't resort to the bindingness of a nation state, the taking for granted of being part of the one polity. So what it has to do is really work hard at experimentation and work hard at consensus, at trying to ensure that the greatest number are agreed on the way forward at any one time. Now, there's one very serious cleavage in the EU, and you mentioned it in your introduction, that the EU is really struggling with, and that's the rule of law crisis. Neither Poland nor Hungary, and probably not Bulgaria, would be admitted as member states of the EU today. So that cleavage is a very serious European cleavage and a problem. So on the capacity to act, I think that there's the way in which the EU is constructed. The heads of government are investing very heavily in that collective power Europe. They invest time, their Sherpas are on the phone to each other nonstop. So there's a lot of collective work going on all of the time in this system, trying to overcome differences, disagreements, and also trying to make progress. And I think those strategic issues I identified are very compelling indeed. That those great geopolitical shifts that we see, et cetera, are very compelling. So the collective response will be towards internal and external pressures, but it will be messy, patchy, and certainly one one shouldn't look to optimal policies at all times.
Just unmute myself. I think I would be used to it at this point. Anyway, thank you very much. That's fascinating. And so there's a couple of questions that take the first two together, as I think they're somewhat related. So Dagmar Chica asks, well, first of all, thank you for a great talk about Ireland's. In what way could Ireland be important from the EU? How it could enhance mutuality in this relationship, and it also links to the question as to whether and how Ireland will overcome the dependence from the UK by a proactive stance within the European Union. And then the second question, which is from Sven Schroers, how do you see Ireland's future in the EU in terms of strategic cooperation with other member states after Brexit? So do you think the Hanseatic League could grow in importance? Do you see other alliances emerging? So I suppose Ireland's position, contribution, the way it positions itself vis-a-vis Europe and the other member states in Europe. And then, yeah, I'll take the later questions then after that. Okay.
Thank you both very, very much for the questions. On what Ireland can do in terms of enhancing mutuality in the EU, I think that one has to accept that Ireland is a small state and has limited, there are limits on its power and its influence. But because of size, small states are often smart states, and we should aspire always to be a smart state. And by that I mean that we build coalitions of the willing, that we maintain contact with all of the other partners in Europe. Ireland is the only small member state with an embassy in every European member state of the small, and that we that we use whatever offices of responsibility that are given to the Irish, like, for example, Pascal Donoghue as president of the Eurogroup, or Philip Lane as chief economist of the ECB, and Mairead McGuinness also in finance, that again is used and put to the service of the EU as a whole. I think we certainly can play not a bridge to Washington, because Washington goes straight to Berlin, Paris, and Brussels. But again, Ireland's contacts beyond the president and the administration are very strong. They're very strong in Congress and the Senate. So again, I think that's something that Ireland can bring. And then in terms of being proactive in the EU, so Ireland has traditionally, and I've analysed Irish EU policy from the 1970s onwards, so from the beginning, Ireland has always been extremely proactive when it wants to be. So I can go back as far as the milk quota crisis of the early 1980s, and the Irish handled that the way they handled Brexit. They just developed arguments, made the diplomatic and political connections, and kept working the system. But Brexit forces Ireland out of its comfort zone. It forced it because Ireland had to put as a number one priority for the 26 other countries. And this was not a place Ireland had ever been before. And so leaving the comfort zone, in my view, was very good for the country, for our diplomatic service and our political system, in that you can't achieve the level of solidarity Ireland achieved without really working the system. So I think that there's a legacy of communication. Ireland has always run good presidencies. It's done the things it should do always pretty well. But it should learn from Brexit that connections matter, and therefore that it needs strategic relationship. And this is going on to the second question, Ireland's strategic cooperation. So yes, Ireland does share some mutuality with the Hansestadt states, but Ireland did not want to find itself with the Frugals. And it was of the Hansa states, it was the one that broke with the Frugals. And that was very smart. Ireland should not, given our experience of the financial crisis, have been on the wrong side of history in those negotiations. So I think Ireland will maintain links with the Northwest European small states, but it will also pay a lot of attention to Paris, Berlin, and I would say it should pay a lot of attention to Rome and Madrid, and then also not to forget the eastern half of the continent. So it needs, because Ireland doesn't have natural geographic allies. So it can't be Benelux or Visegrad or Franco-German. It's none of the subsystems. So it's got to work the entire system. And it has the diplomatic capacity to do so. And I know that a practice has developed in foreign affairs where the ambassadors of different regions of the EU, Irish ambassadors of different regions of the EU, now meet regularly. And so, in other words, that regional focus is very important. And positioning Irish people in important positions in the EU. Obviously, the generations of great Irish functionaries, Catherine Day as David O'Sullivan and many like them, again, attention needs to be paid to making sure that there are Irish functionaries in the institutions.
Interesting. Okay, so the next two questions actually conveniently touch on the same topic as well, and they actually question of the UK and sovereignty. Ju asks if the UK will become more dependent. So contrasting the position of the UK as a member state and then outside the European Union, and asking whether the UK will become more dependent on the EU outside than it was as a member state. And then as a consequence, is it likely that the future relationship will evolve taking into account material issues rather than an idealized narrative? So presumably the focus will shift back to bread and butter issues and the material relationship between the two polities. And then Phil also asks about sovereignty, and it's more the global Britain question around that if the UK pursues a purist sovereign stance, this is kind of me paraphrasing, Phil doesn't see how this could work for the UK within the WTO or indeed with other trade deals with other nations, and the key being interdependence, and that all trade deals and I presume any deep international relations are built on questions of interdependence. And so, whether if you could comment on that, whether this UK idealized notion, this purist form of sovereignty, I suppose it will fit with the UK pursuing relations outside in a post-Brexit world.
Again, great questions. On the future relationship, I mean, it remains an extraordinary puzzle of how a Conservative party that was always seen in the UK as the party of business could, to such an extent, ignore the needs of the British economy in these negotiations. It really is an extraordinary set of political events that meant that you got the hardest of hard Brexit, even if you got Brexit. But there were so many forms that Brexit might have taken that would have at least reduced or contained the frictions involved in leaving the single market and the customs union. But the UK the negotiators did not want them. They didn't want the mobility chapter, which would have been good for the fashion industry and the other creative industries, where the UK is a leader. The service industries were trounced, the city. So how is it that we ended up there, and that it was the party, a Conservative party? I think the UK politics has to go through this phase before we begin to see a rebuilding. There will be attempts to reduce friction over time, but the UK will have to give in on some of those red lines, and particularly, I would say, mobility of people. Now, could it be that they make an offer on mobility of highly skilled? And the question is, should the EU accept an offer on the highly skilled only? And what the implications that implies for free internally. So, but there now is a commission involving business and politicians, Hilary Benn, and they're now hearing evidence about the frictions involved in Brexit. And I think you'll get a lot of demands from the UK. But what the demands will always be couched in: the EU needs to be pragmatic and the EU needs to be creative. And whenever a UK spokesperson uses creativity or pragmatism, they want a special deal. They want the UK to be treated exceptionally. And I think one of the reasons why both the Commission and the Council have created units staffed by very skilled people to watch the horizontal is precisely to watch the post-TCA cherry picking, because they see it coming. They see it coming. But I think eventually there will have to be a deepening of the relationship. I mean, again, in the area of foreign policy, it's extraordinary that the UK, in its integrated review, there was barely a mention of the EU. It was all the national capitals. And that brings me to the second question about global Britain, the nation state view of the world. So I would say that the big problem that the UK had with interdependence and sovereignty was with the EU. I probably am over-arguing the case to say that fundamentally, this government does not accept the legitimacy of the EU model of sharing sovereignty. I would put it that strongly. Now, am I overstating the case? Well, let's see what the UK agrees to if it wants a trade deal with the United States, because the United States does tough when it negotiates trade deals. So what would it agree to in terms of US food standards, et cetera, et cetera? So we will only see over time, as the UK makes not rollover trade agreements, where it's basically taking what it now has as an EU member state and expanding, when it really goes to something much larger. And if the UK is willing to accept more constraints in trade deals with non-European states rather than its EU neighbours, then the issue is the legitimacy in the eyes of London of your organisation, as David Frost pejoratively called it. I mean, the relationship between Barnier and Frost was frosty because they were on two different planets. I think it's a very interesting question, and it's something to watch, how the UK behaves in global trade relations beyond the EU.
We're drawing to a close now, and unfortunately a few questions will come in which and we won't have time to answer them all, but I am going to end on one question which I think is kind of interesting, so apologies to people that I might have skipped with. If you were commissioned by the European Union to advise on how to get the UK back into the EU, then what would your advice be to the EU? I'm not sure if that situation would ever arise. But in any case, I wonder if you'd have any response to that. Yes.
So firstly, I don't think it's in the interests of the EU that the UK re-enters the EU unless there's a domestic consensus on the issue. The EU would be unwise, to put it most politely, to engage in accession with the UK until it's a settled question at domestic level. Because then, for example, you get a Labour government. Does a Tony Blair wins 3 elections, wants to rejoin the EU? Very hypothetical, I think, but it does. Then the Conservative Party come back in, it's still riven on the European issue, and they start unraveling the process again. Nuts. So I would say that there is a period of improving relations between the UK and the EU, of putting them on a more stable equilibrium, long before there can be any question that the UK is readmitted. You could envisage a very different EU, which reorganizes itself into different cores, where you would have an outer rim with countries that will not be full member states, but have an associated membership of some kind or another. Andrew Duff, for example, he suggests this from time to time. But that would be a very different EU to the EU we have today. And I'm not sure that there would be any appetite in EU capitals to go there, to basically reorganize on a concentric circles model the EU. But I think that's the only circumstances in which I could see the UK over the next 20 to 25 years being becoming a member state again. So I think my advice would be very short: don't go there.
Wonderful. Fascinating. So that was Vincent Power's question, by the way. So I'm going to have to draw what was a fascinating, engaging, really informing talk to a close. I think that it's very, very important that we get this kind of insight. These are issues which have profound effect on Ireland. I think there's an incredible degree of complexity to Ireland's position at the moment in the world, in Europe, in a time of great historical change. And I think given that these things may very well end up with the electorate, but most certainly with the broader political system in Ireland facing very deep questions, I think it's wonderful service to give us this insight and to give us this information, and hopefully to continue to contribute. So thank you very much, Professor Laffan. I would love to be able to give you a gift, which and present you with something, but let me just give you my thanks at the moment, for the moment, and hopefully we will have you in Cork in some time in the not too distant future. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to everybody for their questions, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.